This dramatization is based on real events, but some details have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved. The purpose is educational, showing how seemingly minor conflicts can escalate when dialogue and understanding are abandoned. The summer of 1992 in Boston was one of the hottest on record. Temperatures reached unprecedented levels, and the city simmered under oppressive heat that transformed asphalt into furnaces and made even shadows offer little relief. It was in this setting that small entrepreneurs found golden opportunities, and where seemingly innocent rivalries could take on unthinkable dimensions. This is the story of how a commercial dispute between two ice cream vendors transformed into one of the decade's most shocking urban tragedies in Boston. This is not a story about violence, but about the invisible forces that can transform healthy competition into destructive obsession. It is a study of wounded pride, economic pressures, and the precise moment when everyday conflicts cross an irreversible line. Through reconstructed interviews, neighborhood testimonies, and official records, we explore not only the events that culminated in tragedy, but the complex social fabric that allowed a commercial rivalry to escalate without control. This is a reflection on community, ambition, and the devastating consequences when mediation systems fail. Names have been changed to protect the families involved, but the dynamics explored reflect urban realities that remain relevant today. Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way, we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. The melodic chimes of Turkey in the Straw echoed through the narrow streets of Southie as Michael O'Sullivan guided his pristine white ice cream truck around the corner of East Broadway. It was June 15th, 1992, and the morning sun already promised another scorching day in what would become Boston's most memorable summer. At 34, Michael had been working the ice cream routes for 8 years, long enough to know that timing was everything in this business. The first truck to reach the playgrounds, the first to stake out the basketball courts, the first to claim the corner where 3 neighborhoods intersected, that truck would make the real money. Michael's route through South Boston had been carefully cultivated over the years. He knew Mrs. Flanagan would be waiting at Dorchester Street with exact change for her grandson's daily bomb pop. He knew the teenagers at M Street Beach would pool their money for the expensive novelty bars. Most importantly, he knew that Riverside Park, with its sprawling playground and perpetually crowded basketball courts, was his golden goose. On a day like today, when the weather forecast predicted temperatures reaching 95 degrees, that single stop could generate more revenue than some vendors saw in an entire week. What Michael didn't know, as he adjusted his rearview mirror and checked his inventory one final time, was that another truck had spent the pre-dawn hours parked 2 blocks away, its driver studying the same streets with the same calculating intensity. Tommy Benedetto had arrived in Boston 3 months earlier, driving down from Providence with a battered blue ice cream truck, a thick Rhode Island accent, and what his neighbors would later describe as an unsettling determination to succeed. At 28, Tommy was younger than Michael, but carried himself with the aggressive confidence of someone who had learned to fight for everything he'd ever earned. His truck was older, his equipment less reliable, and his knowledge of Boston's intricate neighborhood politics virtually non-existent. What he lacked in local connections, he made up for in sheer persistence. "You gotta understand," said Eleanor Vasquez, a longtime resident of the area who witnessed the early interactions between the two vendors. Eleanor worked as a crossing guard at the elementary school on West Broadway and had become something of an unofficial neighborhood historian. Back then, there was an understanding about territories, not written down anywhere, mind you, but everyone knew. You didn't just roll into someone else's route and start setting up shop. There was respect involved. The unwritten rules of Boston's ice cream vendor community had evolved over decades. Established drivers had first claimed to routes they'd worked consistently. New vendors were expected to find unclaimed territories or negotiate sharing arrangements. The system wasn't perfect, but it had prevented serious conflicts for years. Disputes were typically resolved through informal mediation by other vendors or neighborhood leaders who understood both the business dynamics and the personalities involved. Tommy either didn't understand these customs or chose to ignore them. On his third day working the Southie area, he positioned his truck at the entrance to Riverside Park 15 minutes before Michael's usual arrival time. When Michael pulled up and saw the blue truck already claiming his most profitable spot, he initially assumed it was a simple misunderstanding. "Excuse me," Michael called out, walking over to where Tommy was arranging his serving window display. "I think there might be some confusion here. This is usually my spot." Tommy looked up from his inventory sheet, his expression neutral, but his posture suggesting he'd been expecting this conversation. "Don't see your name on it," he replied, his Rhode Island accent making the words sound sharper than they might have been intended. "Public street, far as I can tell." The exchange lasted less than 5 minutes, both men maintaining civil tones, while children and parents began gathering around Tommy's truck. Michael found himself in an impossible position: cause a scene in front of customers and risk damaging his reputation, or concede the spot and accept a significant financial loss on what was shaping up to be one of the most profitable days of the year. Michael chose discretion, setting up his truck 3 blocks away at a less lucrative location. But as he watched families walk past his truck toward the distant sound of Tommy's chimes, he felt something he hadn't experienced in his 8 years of vendor work: a burning sense of injustice that sat in his chest like indigestion. That first day, "You could see it in Michael's face," recalled Janet Morrison, a regular customer who lived near the park. "He was trying to be professional about it, but you could tell he was seething. When my daughter asked why we had to walk so far to get to his truck, he just smiled and said sometimes things change, but his jaw was clenched the whole time." Over the following week, what began as a territorial dispute evolved into a complex psychological chess match. Tommy continued claiming the prime Riverside Park location each morning, arriving progressively earlier to ensure he maintained his advantage. Michael responded by altering his entire route schedule, attempting to reach other profitable stops before Tommy could claim them. The competition forced both men into an exhausting routine of pre-dawn departures and increasingly aggressive driving between locations. The neighborhood began to take notice. Regular customers found themselves caught in the middle of an escalating rivalry that affected their daily routines. Some families developed loyalties to one vendor or the other, while others simply gravitated toward whichever truck was more conveniently located. Children, unaware of the growing tension, often asked why there were suddenly 2 ice cream trucks playing the same song at the same time. "It was like watching 2 dogs circle each other," observed Frank Donnelly, who ran a convenience store near one of the disputed corners. Neither one wanted to back down, but neither one wanted to be the first to escalate things either. Tommy was new and trying to establish himself. Michael had been around long enough that he felt like he was defending something that belonged to him. Both of them had valid points, which made it worse. The first direct confrontation occurred on June 22nd, exactly 1 week after their initial encounter. Michael had arrived at Riverside Park at 6:45 a.m., a full hour earlier than his usual schedule, only to find Tommy's blue truck already positioned in the prime spot. This time, Michael didn't approach with diplomatic language. "This is getting ridiculous," Michael said, his voice carrying across the empty park as Tommy prepared his morning inventory. "You know this is my route. You know you're costing me money. What's your endgame here?" Tommy emerged from his truck holding a clipboard, his expression suggesting he'd been expecting this escalation. "My endgame is running a business," he replied. "Same as you. Difference is, I'm not living in the past." The conversation that followed would be recounted and analyzed by neighborhood witnesses for months afterward. Both men remained outwardly calm, but their body language suggested a conflict that went deeper than simple business competition. Michael felt his established territory being invaded by someone who refused to acknowledge local customs. Tommy felt he was being bullied by an entrenched competitor who wanted to maintain an unfair monopoly. They were both right in a way, reflected Father Patrick Murphy, who served at the local Catholic church and often mediated neighborhood disputes. Michael had put in years of work building relationships and understanding what each family wanted. That's worth something. But Tommy was also right, that public streets don't belong to anyone. The problem was that they were having 2 different conversations. Michael was talking about respect and tradition. Tommy was talking about free market competition. As June progressed into July, the rivalry began affecting both men's behavior in ways that concerned those who knew them well. Michael, typically known for his friendly demeanor and willingness to extend credit to regular customers, became increasingly irritable and suspicious. He began questioning the loyalty of long-time customers who occasionally bought from Tommy's truck. He started keeping detailed records of Tommy's movements, noting arrival times and location choices with the intensity of a private investigator. Tommy, meanwhile, seemed to interpret every aspect of the competition as a personal challenge. He began offering slightly lower prices than Michael, eating into his own profit margins in order to steal customers. He extended his operating hours, staying in the neighborhood well past the traditional closing time when most vendors returned to their depots. Most significantly, he started expanding his territory beyond the areas where he'd initially conflicted with Michael, systematically challenging established vendors throughout South Boston. The breaking point came during the week of July 4th, when Boston's annual Independence Day celebrations brought unprecedented crowds to the neighborhood's parks and public spaces. Both vendors recognized the holiday week as potentially the most profitable period of the entire summer. Both men planned to work extended hours and cover as many locations as possible. On July the 2nd, Tommy made a decision that would later be seen as the final escalation before everything spiraled beyond control. He purchased a second ice cream truck. The appearance of two blue trucks bearing Benedetto's ice cream signage sent shockwaves through the vendor community. Tommy had not only refused to respect established territories, he was now actively expanding his operation to dominate them. The second truck, operated by his younger brother Anthony, allowed Tommy to cover twice as many locations while maintaining his challenge to Michael's primary route. Michael's response was swift, and according to several witnesses, uncharacteristically aggressive. On the afternoon of July 3rd, he confronted Tommy at a busy intersection where both trucks had arrived simultaneously to serve the pre-holiday crowds. Two trucks now. Michael's voice carried an edge that made nearby parents instinctively move their children away from the confrontation. "You're not just competing anymore. You're trying to put me out of business." Tommy's response would be remembered by everyone who heard it. "Business is business, Mike. If you can't handle the competition, maybe it's time to find a new line of work." The words hung in the humid July air, like a challenge that couldn't be taken back. As both men returned to their trucks and continued serving customers, the neighborhood sensed that something fundamental had shifted. The rivalry had crossed from professional competition into personal warfare, and everyone could feel the change in atmosphere. July 4th, 1992 dawned with the kind of oppressive humidity that made Boston feel like a pressure cooker waiting to explode. By 7 a.m., the temperature had already climbed to 82 degrees, and the National Weather Service had issued a heat advisory predicting the mercury would top 100 degrees before noon. It was the kind of day that ice cream vendors dreamed about, and the kind of day that could make or break a summer's earnings. Michael O'Sullivan had barely slept. He'd spent most of the night in his cramped apartment above Mulaney's pub, staring at a hand-drawn map of South Boston that he'd covered with colored pins representing prime vending locations. Red pins marked his traditional stops. Blue pins showed where Tommy Benedetto had been setting up. Yellow pins indicated areas where both trucks had clashed. Looking at the map in the pre-dawn darkness, Michael realized that blue pins now outnumbered red ones 2-1. The math was devastating. After 8 years of building his route, cultivating customer relationships and establishing what he'd believed was a sustainable business, Michael was facing the prospect of losing more than half his income to an outsider who'd been in Boston for barely 3 months. Worse, Tommy's expansion showed no signs of slowing. The addition of a second truck suggested ambitions that went far beyond claiming a few contested corners. "Michael was always a quiet guy, kept to himself mostly," recalled Danny McKenzie, who tended bar at Mulaney's and had known Michael since he'd started the ice cream route. But that week before the 4th, you could see something eating at him. He'd come down for breakfast, barely touch his food and just stare out the window like he was working out some kind of problem. I asked him once if everything was okay, and he just said business was getting complicated. At the same time, 3 miles away in a rented garage in Dorchester, Tommy Benedetto was experiencing his own sleepless night, but for entirely different reasons. Where Michael saw invasion and injustice, Tommy saw opportunity and vindication. The success of his expansion had exceeded his wildest expectations. In just 2 weeks operating 2 trucks, he generated more revenue than his entire first month in Boston. More importantly, he'd proven to himself that his aggressive approach could overcome the entrenched advantages of established vendors. Tommy had always been driven by a profound need to prove himself. Growing up in Providence as the youngest of 5 brothers, he'd learned early that being polite and waiting your turn meant being ignored and forgotten. His father, a construction worker who'd spent 30 years taking orders from other men, had drilled into Tommy the belief that success came to those who were willing to take what others wouldn't give them freely. "Nobody gives you nothing in this world," was his father's favorite saying, and Tommy had internalized that philosophy completely. Tommy was intense about everything, remembered Maria Santos, who lived in the apartment next to Tommy's in Dorchester. You'd hear him on the phone at all hours, talking to suppliers, negotiating deals, planning routes. He treated that ice cream business like he was running General Motors or something. My kids thought he was a little scary because he was always so serious, but you had to admire his work ethic. The morning of July 4th began with both vendors implementing strategies they'd spent the previous week developing. Michael departed his depot at 5:30 a.m., a full 2 hours earlier than his traditional start time, hoping to claim as many premium locations as possible before Tommy's trucks could challenge them. His plan was to establish a presence at 5 key intersections before 8 a.m., then move rapidly between them throughout the day to maintain his claims. Tommy's strategy was more sophisticated and significantly more aggressive. He'd spent the previous evening conducting reconnaissance, driving through South Boston to identify the locations where crowds would be heaviest during the holiday celebrations. Rather than trying to beat Michael to established spots, Tommy planned to position his trucks at locations Michael had never claimed. Street corners near parade routes, park entrances where families would gather for fireworks viewing, and intersections near public transportation stops where out-of-neighborhood visitors would be arriving throughout the day. The strategy revealed Tommy's fundamental misunderstanding of how the ice cream vendor community functioned in Boston. He saw unclaimed territory as truly unclaimed, free for anyone willing to work it. What he failed to grasp was that many locations were left open by informal agreement among vendors, either because they were marginally profitable, because they conflicted with more established routes, or because claiming them would violate unspoken agreements that kept the overall system functioning peacefully. By 9 a.m., Tommy had positioned his trucks at 2 locations that multiple vendors had traditionally left unclaimed. The corner of West Broadway and Dorchester Street, directly adjacent to the route worked by 63-year-old Patrick "Paddy" O'Brien, and the intersection near the Red Line T-stop that served as neutral ground between 3 different vendor territories. Paddy O'Brien had been selling ice cream in South Boston since 1967. He was a neighborhood institution, known for extending credit to families going through tough times and for giving free ice cream to kids whose parents couldn't afford it. His route was small but loyal, and his presence was viewed by other vendors as a stabilizing force that prevented conflicts and maintained community goodwill. Paddy had never had his territory challenged because everyone understood that he represented something more valuable than simple business competition. When Paddy arrived at his usual Saturday morning spot and found one of Tommy's blue trucks already serving customers, the impact rippled through the vendor community like a seismic shock. This wasn't just another competitive challenge, it was an assault on the fundamental social structure that had governed ice cream sales in the neighborhood for decades. That was when everyone realized this wasn't going to be a normal dispute, explained Rosa Martinez, who ran a community center and often served as an informal mediator for neighborhood conflicts. Challenging Michael was one thing. He was young and strong and could handle the competition. But going after Paddy's route was like challenging someone's grandfather. It crossed a line that nobody had even thought needed to be drawn. Word of Tommy's expansion reached Michael by 10 a.m., delivered by a visibly agitated customer named Mrs. Catherine Sullivan, who had been buying ice cream from Paddy for 15 years. "That new fellow with the blue truck is parked right where Paddy always sets up," she told Michael, her Irish accent thickening with indignation. Poor Paddy's having to work 3 blocks away, and half his regular customers don't even know where to find him. For Michael, the news represented a fundamental shift in the nature of his conflict with Tommy. What had begun as a territorial dispute over profitable locations had evolved into something much more serious, a threat to the entire social ecosystem that made neighborhood ice cream vendors possible. If Tommy could challenge Paddy O'Brien with impunity, then no vendor's route was safe, and the informal agreements that prevented chaos would become meaningless. Michael's response was immediate and uncharacteristic. He abandoned his planned route and drove directly to where Tommy was positioned outside the T-stop, parking his white truck close enough to the blue one that customers would have to choose between them. It was the first time Michael had engaged in direct confrontational positioning, and the message was clear. If Tommy wanted to escalate, Michael was prepared to match him. The result was predictable and devastating. Both trucks played their musical chimes simultaneously, creating a cacophonous duet that frustrated customers and confused children. Both vendors offered competing prices and promotions, turning what should have been simple ice cream purchases into uncomfortable choices between rival camps. Most significantly, both men began making increasingly aggressive attempts to attract customers, calling out descriptions of their products and actively competing for the attention of approaching families. It was embarrassing to watch, recalled Jennifer Walsh, who witnessed the confrontation while waiting for the tea with her 2 young children. Here are 2 grown men basically shouting at each other through ice cream truck speakers, and there are kids everywhere just wanting to buy popsicles. My daughter asked me why the ice cream men were so angry, and I didn't know how to explain it to her. The dual truck standoff lasted for 3 hours, generating complaints from residents, business owners, and MBTA officials who were concerned about the disruption to public transportation access. By 1 p.m., both vendors had been asked to move by transit police, but the precedent had been established. The conflict was no longer limited to Michael and Tommy. It now involved the broader vendor community and city authorities. Throughout the afternoon, reports reached both men of similar confrontations occurring at other locations around the neighborhood. Tommy's brother, Anthony, had engaged in a pricing war with another established vendor near Castle Island. Paddy O'Brien had been forced to abandon his traditional afternoon stop when he couldn't compete with the novelty items and aggressive marketing of the blue truck that had claimed his morning location. 3 separate residents had called the city's non-emergency line to complain about excessive noise and disruption from competing ice cream trucks. By evening, what had started as a business rivalry had become a neighborhood crisis. The informal system that had regulated ice cream vendor relationships for decades was collapsing under the pressure of Tommy's expansion, and no one seemed to know how to restore order without acknowledging that the old agreements had never been officially recognized or enforceable. The breaking point came at 6:30 p.m. during the traditional pre-fireworks rush when families throughout South Boston made final purchases before gathering to watch the Independence Day celebration. Michael and Tommy found themselves positioned at opposite ends of the same city block, both serving steady streams of customers who were preparing for the evening festivities. The confrontation began when a young boy, perhaps 8 years old, approached Michael's truck and asked for a specific novelty item that Michael didn't carry. Michael directed the child to Tommy's truck, saying, "The blue truck down the street might have what you're looking for." It was a gesture of professionalism that Michael had extended countless times over the years, acknowledging that customer satisfaction mattered more than individual sales. Tommy's response to receiving the redirected customer was to begin actively soliciting Michael's existing customers, calling out to people walking toward the white truck and offering them lower prices for the same items. When an elderly man named George Callahan, who had been buying from Michael for 6 years, was intercepted by Tommy's aggressive sales pitch, Michael reached his breaking point. "Hey!" Michael called out, abandoning his serving window and walking toward Tommy's truck. "What the hell are you doing?" Tommy emerged from his truck with a confidence that suggested he'd been expecting this confrontation. "Selling ice cream," he replied. "Same as you." "No," Michael said, his voice carrying clearly in the humid evening air. "You're not selling ice cream, you're trying to destroy everyone else's business. There's a difference." The argument that followed drew a crowd of perhaps 30 people, including families with small children who had simply been trying to buy treats before the fireworks. Both men remained focused on business justifications for their positions, but their voices carried undertones of personal animosity that made everyone uncomfortable. "You think you own these streets," Tommy said, his Rhode Island accent making the words sound more confrontational than they might have otherwise. "You think because you've been here longer, you get to decide who can work and who can't. That's not how the world works anymore." "I don't want to own anything," Michael replied. "I just want to work the route I've been building for 8 years, without having some outsider try to drive me out of business, sir." The crowd that had gathered to watch the argument included several people who would later provide detailed accounts to police investigators. Their descriptions consistently emphasized that both men remained physically non-threatening throughout the exchange, but that the intensity of their conflict seemed disproportionate to its ostensible cause. "They were talking about ice cream routes and business competition," observed Father Murphy, who had been walking past when the argument began. But you could tell they were really arguing about something much deeper. Michael felt like his whole way of life was being attacked. Tommy felt like he was fighting for his right to exist. Neither one was completely wrong, which made it impossible for either one to back down. The argument ended without resolution when both men returned to their trucks to serve customers. But the damage to community relationships was irreversible. Word of the public confrontation spread quickly through the neighborhood's informal communication networks. Residents began choosing sides, with longtime families generally supporting Michael and newer residents often sympathizing with Tommy's competitive approach. More ominously, other ice cream vendors began reporting that the conflict was affecting their own operations. Customers were asking questions about the rivalry. Children were becoming confused about which truck to approach, and the general atmosphere around ice cream sales had shifted from pleasant anticipation to uncomfortable tension. As the July 4th fireworks lit up Boston Harbor, both Michael O'Sullivan and Tommy Benedetto were counting the day's receipts and planning strategies for the remainder of the summer. Neither man realized that their escalating rivalry had already attracted the attention of people who had no stake in ice cream sales, but considerable interest in any conflict that was disrupting neighborhood stability. The morning of July 6th brought an ominous stillness to South Boston that had nothing to do with the weather. The heat wave that had gripped the city for 2 weeks showed no signs of breaking, but something else had shifted in the neighborhood's atmosphere. Word of the public confrontation between Michael O'Sullivan and Tommy Benedetto had spread through the community's intricate network of barbershops, corner stores, and parish coffee hours with the speed and distortion that characterized all neighborhood gossip. By sunrise, the story had evolved into multiple versions, each shaped by the teller's loyalties and perspective. In some accounts, Michael had been the aggressor, finally revealing the territorial arrogance that long-established vendors harbored toward newcomers. In others, Tommy was painted as a ruthless outsider who had deliberately provoked a respected local businessman into an uncharacteristic loss of control. The truth, as usual, was more complex than either narrative acknowledged, but complexity offered little comfort to residents who simply wanted to buy ice cream for their children without navigating an increasingly uncomfortable social minefield. Michael spent the early morning hours in his apartment, drinking coffee that had gone cold and studying newspaper-classified ads for other employment opportunities. For the first time since he'd purchased his ice cream truck 8 years earlier, he was seriously considering whether the business was still viable. The previous day's receipts had been the lowest he'd recorded on a July 4th since his rookie season, and the psychological toll of constant conflict was beginning to outweigh whatever profit margins remained available. "I'd been doing this for 8 years, Michael would later tell investigators, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had fought longer than he'd intended. 8 years of building relationships, learning what Mrs. Donnelly's grandkids liked, remembering that the Johnson family always ordered the same thing every Tuesday. That's not just business, that's community. And suddenly I'm supposed to compete with someone who treats every interaction like a hostile takeover." 3 miles away, Tommy Benedetto was experiencing no such doubts about his chosen strategy. The success of his expansion had vindicated every aggressive decision he'd made since arriving in Boston. His 2 trucks had generated more revenue during the July 4th weekend than many established vendors earned in an entire month. More importantly, his willingness to challenge territorial boundaries had exposed what he saw as the artificial scarcity that had kept ice cream vending profitable for entrenched operators while excluding ambitious newcomers. Tommy's confidence was reinforced by his younger brother Anthony, who had driven up from Providence to operate the second truck and had quickly embraced Tommy's confrontational approach to business competition. Anthony was 24 years old, recently laid off from a construction job, and eager to prove himself worthy of the family business venture. His youth and inexperience made him even more aggressive than Tommy in pursuing customers and challenging established vendors. Anthony was like a younger version of Tommy, but with less self-control, recalled David Chen, who operated a small grocery store near one of the contested intersections. Tommy at least tried to be professional about it. Even when he was being aggressive, Anthony would actually interrupt customers who were talking to other vendors, offering them better deals in the middle of their transactions. It was incredibly rude, but it worked. The week following July 4th marked the beginning of what neighborhood residents would later describe as the Ice Cream Wars. What had started as a rivalry between two vendors evolved into a systematic campaign by the Benedetto brothers to dominate every profitable location in South Boston. Their strategy was simple and effective: identify high-traffic areas currently served by established vendors, position their trucks to compete directly for the same customers, and use aggressive pricing and marketing to capture market share. The approach devastated the informal equilibrium that had governed ice cream sales in the neighborhood for decades. Vendors who had operated peacefully for years suddenly found themselves forced to choose between abandoning profitable locations or engaging in price wars that eliminated their profit margins. Several long-time operators began considering whether to relocate to other neighborhoods or exit the business entirely. It was like watching dominoes fall, explained Patricia Kelly, a social worker who lived in the area and had become fascinated by the social dynamics of the escalating conflict. The Benedetto brothers weren't just competing with Michael anymore. They were systematically challenging every vendor in South Boston, and the other vendors didn't know how to respond. Some tried to fight back with their own aggressive tactics. Others just tried to avoid confrontation and ended up losing their best customers. The breakdown of vendor cooperation created cascading effects throughout the community. Children became confused about which truck to approach, sometimes walking back and forth between competing vendors, while parents struggled to explain why the ice cream men seemed angry at each other. Elderly customers who had developed personal relationships with long-time vendors felt caught in the middle of conflicts they didn't understand or want to participate in. Most significantly, the atmosphere around ice cream purchases shifted from pleasant anticipation to uncomfortable tension that affected the entire neighborhood's social dynamic. Michael's response to the expanding conflict reflected his fundamental misunderstanding of what he was truly fighting against. He continued to approach the rivalry as a territorial dispute that could be resolved through persistence and professional behavior, failing to recognize that Tommy's objectives went far beyond claiming a few contested corners. While Michael focused on defending his established route, Tommy was systematically dismantling the entire framework that made traditional ice cream vending possible. The first direct intervention by city authorities occurred on July 9th, when Sergeant Robert Flanagan of the South Boston Police responded to multiple noise complaints about competing ice cream trucks. Flanagan found Michael and Anthony Benedetto positioned at opposite ends of the same block, both playing their musical chimes at maximum volume while calling out competing descriptions of their products. The cacophony was audible from 3 blocks away and had prompted angry calls from residents who worked night shifts and were trying to sleep during the day. "I've been a cop in this neighborhood for 12 years, Sergeant Flanagan explained to both vendors as he documented the complaint. "I've seen disputes over parking spaces, arguments about property lines, fights over everything you can imagine, but I've never had to mediate a conflict between ice cream trucks. This is getting out of hand." Flanagan's intervention established an important precedent. The conflict between the vendors was no longer considered a private business matter, but a public order issue that required official attention. However, his authority was limited to enforcing noise ordinances and ensuring public safety. He could not resolve the underlying territorial disputes or force either side to respect the informal agreements that had previously governed vendor relationships. The limitations of official mediation became apparent immediately after Flanagan's departure. Both vendors resumed their competing operations, but with slightly reduced volume levels that technically complied with city noise regulations while maintaining the same level of commercial aggression. The result satisfied no one. Residents continued to be frustrated by the ongoing tension, vendors continued to lose money to destructive competition, and police continued to receive complaints about situations they were not equipped to resolve. Michael's frustration with the ineffectiveness of official intervention led him to seek support from other members of the ice cream vendor community. He organized an informal meeting at Mulaney's pub on the evening of July 11th, hoping to develop a coordinated response to what he saw as a threat to everyone's livelihood. The meeting was attended by 6 other vendors who operated in South Boston and surrounding neighborhoods, including Paddy O'Brien, whose 60-year-old route had been directly challenged by Tommy's expansion. "We need to stick together on this," Michael argued, addressing the small group gathered around a corner table in the pub's dimly lit back room. "If we let the Benedetto brothers get away with this territorial grab, none of our routes will be safe. Today, it's my corner and Paddy's tea stop. Tomorrow it could be any of your locations." The response from his fellow vendors revealed the complexity of the situation and the difficulty of organizing collective action against aggressive competition. Some, like Paddy O'Brien, were sympathetic to Michael's position, but lacked the energy or resources for an extended conflict. Others, particularly younger vendors who operated in less established areas, saw Tommy's challenge as potentially beneficial if it forced the modernization of outdated territorial agreements. "Look, I understand what you're going through," said Carmen Rodriguez, who had been operating an ice cream truck in nearby Dorchester for 3 years. "But maybe some of these old arrangements needed to be challenged. Why should prime locations be off limits just because someone claimed them first? If Tommy can provide better service or better prices, maybe customers should have that choice." The meeting ended without consensus or coordinated action, leaving Michael to recognize that he could not count on support from other vendors in his conflict with Tommy. Worse, the discussion revealed that some members of the ice cream vendor community saw his struggle as representative of an outdated approach to business that deserved to be replaced by more aggressive competition. The isolation forced Michael to confront the possibility that his understanding of how the ice cream business should function was fundamentally incompatible with the changing economics of urban entrepreneurship. The informal agreements and territorial respect that had made his career possible might have been artifacts of an earlier era, when neighborhood relationships mattered more than pure market efficiency. Meanwhile, Tommy's success continued to accelerate beyond his most optimistic projections. By mid-July, his 2 trucks were generating daily revenues that exceeded what his single truck had earned in an entire week during his first month in Boston. The profits allowed him to upgrade his equipment, expand his product offerings, and begin considering additional expansion that would extend his operations beyond South Boston into other neighborhoods. Tommy's growing confidence manifested itself in increasingly bold strategic decisions. On July 14th, he positioned one of his trucks directly outside St. Augustine's Church during Sunday morning services, claiming the sidewalk space where Paddy O'Brien had sold ice cream to families after Mass for more than 20 years. The move was both symbolically and economically devastating. It challenged the most traditional and respected vendor in the community at his most established location, while generating substantial revenue from a captive customer base. Father Murphy witnessed the confrontation between Tommy and several parishioners who questioned his decision to compete with Paddy in such a direct and disrespectful manner. "Young man," one elderly woman told Tommy, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "Mr. O'Brien has been serving this community since before you were born. Don't you think you could find somewhere else to park your truck?" Tommy's response revealed how completely he had committed to his aggressive strategy. "Ma'am, I respect Mr. O'Brien, but I've got a business to run and bills to pay. If he wants to compete for this location, he's welcome to try, but I'm not giving up a good spot just because he's been around longer." The exchange was witnessed by dozens of church members and quickly became the defining moment in Tommy's relationship with the broader South Boston community. His refusal to acknowledge the social and cultural significance of Paddy's established position marked him as someone who either didn't understand or didn't care about the informal networks of respect and reciprocity that governed neighborhood life. Word of the church incident reached Michael within hours, delivered by Mrs. Sullivan, who attended early mass and had witnessed the entire confrontation. Her account of Tommy's dismissive response to community pressure confirmed Michael's worst fears about his rival's ultimate intentions and methods. "He's not just trying to compete," Michael told Danny McKenzie that afternoon, his voice carrying a mixture of anger and resignation. "He's trying to prove that nothing we've built here matters. Not the relationships, not the traditions, not the respect we've shown each other for years. He wants to tear it all down and replace it with something uglier." The psychological impact of the sustained conflict was beginning to affect both men in ways that went beyond simple business competition. Michael, who had always prided himself on his professionalism and community relationships, found himself consumed by resentment towards someone he barely knew. Tommy, who had initially seen his aggressive strategy as simply necessary business practice, was developing a personal animosity toward Michael that seemed disproportionate to their actual interactions. "They were both getting obsessed with each other," observed Rosa Martinez from her community center office. "I'd see them driving around the neighborhood at all hours, checking where the other guy was positioned, planning their next moves. It wasn't healthy business competition anymore. It was like they were locked in some kind of psychological warfare." The escalation accelerated dramatically on July 18th, when Michael decided to implement his own aggressive counter-strategy. Instead of continuing to react defensively to Tommy's territorial challenges, he began proactively targeting locations where the Benedetto brothers had established themselves, attempting to reclaim market share through direct competition. Michael's new approach represented a fundamental change in his understanding of the conflict. He abandoned his reliance on established relationships and territorial agreements, embracing the same aggressive tactics that had made Tommy successful. The transformation was immediately apparent to customers and other vendors who saw Michael adopting the confrontational methods he had previously condemned. "It was sad to watch," recalled Jennifer Walsh, who had been buying ice cream from Michael for several years. "He was always so friendly and relaxed before all this started, but by that third week of July, he was as intense and competitive as the new guy. You could see the stress in his face, hear it in his voice. He wasn't the same person anymore." The culmination of Michael's strategic shift came on July 19th, when he positioned his white truck directly adjacent to one of Tommy's established locations near Castle Island, creating the same type of head-to-head competition that had frustrated him when Tommy had used the tactic. The result was predictably destructive. Both vendors lost money, serving a customer base that was large enough to support one profitable operation, but insufficient for two competing trucks. More significantly, Michael's adoption of Tommy's aggressive methods eliminated any moral authority he might have claimed in the conflict. He could no longer position himself as the defender of traditional values against disruptive newcomers when he was engaging in the same disruptive behaviors he had criticized. The psychological toll of the sustained competition was evident in both men's increasingly erratic behavior. Michael began working 14-hour days, departing his depot before dawn, and returning after dark in an obsessive attempt to maximize revenue and monitor Tommy's activities. Tommy responded by extending his own hours and increasing the frequency of his price cuts, creating a destructive cycle that benefited neither vendor but made both men more determined to outlast their rival. By July 20th, the conflict had evolved into something that transcended rational business competition. Both men were losing money, damaging their health and alienating customers, but neither was willing to acknowledge defeat or seek compromise. The ice cream vendor rivalry had become a test of will that both Michael and Tommy felt they could not afford to lose. The breaking point came on July 21st, during what should have been a routine afternoon at Riverside Park. Michael arrived at the location to find both Benedetto trucks already positioned there, creating an unprecedented three-truck confrontation in the neighborhood's most profitable location. The sight of two blue trucks claiming the territory he had considered his own triggered something in Michael, that went beyond anger into a realm of desperate calculation that would ultimately lead to irreversible consequences. The oppressive heat of July 21, 1992, created a mirage effect on the asphalt around Riverside Park, making the three ice cream trucks shimmer like specters in the afternoon sun. Michael O'Sullivan sat behind the wheel of his white truck, engine idling, watching Tommy and Anthony Benedetto serve a steady stream of customers from their matching blue vehicles. The sight triggered something primal in Michael's chest, a combination of rage, desperation, and disbelief that 8 years of careful relationship building could be dismantled so thoroughly by two men who had been in Boston for less than 4 months. The three-truck standoff represented everything that had gone wrong with the neighborhood's ice cream vendor ecosystem. Where once there had been informal territories respected by mutual agreement, now there was chaos. Where once vendors had cooperated to ensure everyone could make a living, now there was destructive competition that benefited no one. Where once ice cream trucks had been symbols of summer joy for children, now they represented conflict and tension that made parents uncomfortable. I sat there for maybe 20 minutes, just watching them work, Michael would later tell investigators. Watching them serve customers who should have been mine, selling products in a location I'd been working for 8 years. And I realized that everything I'd believed about fairness and community and doing business the right way was meaningless to these guys. They saw my respect for tradition as weakness, and they were exploiting it. Michael's psychological state at that moment represented the culmination of 5 weeks of sustained pressure that had fundamentally altered his worldview. The man who had once taken pride in extending credit to struggling families and giving free ice cream to children whose parents couldn't afford it had been transformed into someone consumed by thoughts of economic survival and personal vindication. The transformation was complete and irreversible. At the same time, Tommy Benedetto was experiencing his own psychological evolution, though in the opposite direction. The success of his aggressive expansion had convinced him that his approach to business was not only effective but morally superior to the territorial arrangements he had disrupted. In his mind, he was bringing modern competitive principles to an industry that had been artificially constrained by outdated social agreements that favored established vendors over ambitious newcomers. Tommy really believed he was doing the right thing, recalled Maria Santos, his neighbor in Dorchester. He'd talk about it like he was fighting some kind of class war against privileged vendors who thought they deserved special treatment just because they'd been around longer. In his mind, he wasn't the aggressor. He was the underdog fighting against an unfair system. The philosophical gulf between the two men had widened beyond any possibility of reconciliation. Michael saw Tommy as a destroyer of community values who prioritized personal profit over neighborhood harmony. Tommy saw Michael as a representative of entrenched privilege who wanted to maintain an unfair monopoly through social pressure rather than competitive excellence. Both perspectives contained elements of truth, which made compromise impossible and conflict inevitable. The afternoon of July 21st began with what appeared to be routine competition between the three trucks, but several witnesses later noted an unusual intensity in Michael's behavior that distinguished this confrontation from previous encounters. Instead of attempting to serve customers or compete for business, Michael seemed focused entirely on observing and documenting the Benedetto brothers' operations. He had a notebook, recalled Patricia Stevens, who was at the park with her 2 children. Michael was writing things down, checking his watch, recording times and details like he was conducting some kind of investigation. It was strange behavior for someone who was supposed to be selling ice cream. Michael's notebook contained detailed observations about the Benedetto brothers' pricing strategies, customer interactions, and operational methods. More ominously, it also included personal information about both men, their approximate ages, physical descriptions, license plate numbers, and residential addresses that Michael had obtained through sources he never disclosed to investigators. The level of surveillance suggested that Michael's conflict with the Benedetto brothers had evolved far beyond business competition into personal obsession. He had begun treating Tommy and Anthony not as commercial rivals, but as enemies who represented an existential threat to his way of life. The distinction was crucial because it indicated a psychological state that could rationalize actions that would normally be unthinkable. Meanwhile, Anthony Benedetto was experiencing his own escalation of hostility toward Michael and the other established vendors who had criticized the brothers' aggressive tactics. As the younger and less experienced brother, Anthony felt additional pressure to prove himself worthy of the family business venture. His response was to become even more confrontational than Tommy in pursuing customers and challenging territorial boundaries. Anthony was getting a kick out of making the other vendors angry, observed David Chen from his grocery store. You could see it in his face when he'd steal a customer from Michael or set up in someone else's usual spot. It wasn't just business for him anymore. It was personal satisfaction at beating people who looked down on him. The dynamic between the brothers had evolved into a feedback loop that reinforced their most aggressive instincts. Tommy's initial success had validated Anthony's confrontational approach, while Anthony's enthusiasm had encouraged Tommy to pursue even bolder expansion strategies. Neither brother provided the moderating influence that might have prevented their rivalry with other vendors from spiraling beyond rational business competition. The psychological deterioration of all three men was accelerated by the physical toll of working 14-hour days in unprecedented heat, while maintaining constant vigilance against competitive threats. Sleep deprivation, dehydration, and stress combined to create decision-making conditions that favored impulsive reactions over careful consideration of consequences. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a psychologist who later studied the case, identified several factors that contributed to the escalating conflict. You had three men under extreme stress, operating in a poorly regulated environment, with no effective mediation mechanisms available. Each was interpreting the other's actions through increasingly paranoid frameworks that justified escalating responses. It was a textbook example of how rational people can be drawn into irrational conflicts when the right combination of pressures converge. The breaking point began to develop on the morning of July 22nd, when Michael arrived at his depot to find that someone had vandalized his truck during the night. The damage was limited but symbolic. Sugar had been poured into his gas tank, forcing him to have the vehicle towed for emergency repairs that would keep him off the road for at least 6 hours during what promised to be another profitable day. Michael immediately suspected the Benedetto brothers, though he had no evidence to support the accusation. The timing of the vandalism, occurring just hours after the three-truck confrontation at Riverside Park, seemed too coincidental to be random. More importantly, Michael's psychological state made him predisposed to interpret any negative event as part of a coordinated campaign against him. "I knew it was them," Michael told Danny McKenzie that morning as he waited for a taxi to take him to the tow lot. "They'd tried everything else to drive me out of business. Now they were going after my equipment. It was an escalation, and I had to respond." Whether or not the Benedetto brothers were actually responsible for the vandalism was never definitively established. Police investigators found no physical evidence linking them to the incident, and both brothers had verifiable alibis for the time period when the damage likely occurred. However, the truth mattered less than Michael's perception, which had been shaped by weeks of conflict into a worldview where any attack on his business must have originated with his rivals. Tommy and Anthony's reaction to news of the vandalism revealed their own evolving attitudes toward the conflict. Rather than expressing sympathy or concern about criminal damage to a competitor's equipment, both brothers seemed to view the incident as confirmation that Michael was losing control and becoming desperate. If someone vandalized his truck, maybe he should look at why someone would want to do that, Tommy told Maria Santos when she asked about the incident. Maybe he's made some enemies by trying to control territory that doesn't belong to him. Anthony's response was even more provocative. "Sounds like someone got tired of his attitude. Can't say I blame them." The brothers' lack of sympathy for Michael's situation eliminated any remaining possibility of reconciliation or compromise. From Michael's perspective, their responses confirmed not only their guilt, but their willingness to escalate the conflict beyond legitimate business competition into personal warfare. The psychological pressure reached a critical point on July 23rd, when Michael returned to work with a repaired truck and immediately encountered both Benedetto brothers positioned at locations he considered his traditional territory. The sight of their blue truck serving his regular customers while his own truck had been sabotaged triggered a rage response that Michael later described as unlike anything he had ever experienced. I felt like everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built, was being stolen while I watched, Michael told investigators. These guys had been in Boston for 4 months, and they thought they could take 8 years of my life and just claim it as their own. The vandalism was just the final proof that they would do whatever it took to destroy me. Michael's response was to begin following the Benedetto trucks throughout the day, documenting their movements and customer interactions with the systematic intensity of a private investigator. He abandoned any pretense of normal business operations, instead focusing entirely on surveillance and intelligence gathering that he believed would eventually provide him with leverage against his rivals. The stalking behavior was noticed immediately by customers, other vendors, and eventually by Tommy and Anthony themselves. Michael's white truck began appearing wherever the blue trucks operated, positioned at a distance that allowed observation but prevented direct competition. The psychological effect on all parties was profound and destabilizing. "It was creepy," recalled Jennifer Walsh, who witnessed Michael's surveillance activities near her home. "He would just sit there in his truck writing in that notebook, watching the other guys work. It wasn't normal business behavior. It felt like something bad was building up." Tommy's initial response to being followed was to attempt direct confrontation with Michael, but these encounters only reinforced both men's conviction that their rival represented an unacceptable threat. On July 24th, Tommy approached Michael's truck while it was positioned across the street from one of his serving locations. "What's your problem, Mike?" Tommy demanded, his Rhode Island accent making the question sound more aggressive than it might have been intended. "You want to compete for customers, compete, but this stalking stuff is crossing a line." Michael's response revealed how completely his mental framework had shifted from business competition to personal warfare. "You crossed the line when you came into my neighborhood and started destroying everything I'd built. You crossed the line when you vandalized my truck. Now you get to live with the consequences." The exchange was witnessed by several customers, including families with children, who had simply wanted to buy ice cream, but found themselves observing what appeared to be a personal feud between two increasingly unstable men. The incident prompted the first serious discussions among neighborhood residents about whether official intervention was necessary to prevent the escalating conflict from affecting public safety. Father Murphy, who had attempted informal mediation earlier in the summer, began receiving calls from parishioners who were concerned about the vendor's deteriorating mental state and increasingly erratic behavior. "People were starting to get scared," Father Murphy later explained. "Not scared of violence necessarily, but scared of unpredictability. When you see adults acting irrationally over something as simple as ice cream sales, it makes you wonder what else might be happening beneath the surface." The community's growing concern was justified by events that unfolded over the weekend of July 25th and 26th. Both Michael and the Benedetto brothers began working extended hours that stretched from before dawn until well after dark, apparently attempting to maximize revenue while monitoring each other's activities. The schedule was physically unsustainable and psychologically destructive, but none of the three men was willing to concede any advantage to his rivals. Sleep deprivation and heat exhaustion combined with pre-existing stress to create decision-making conditions that favored increasingly extreme responses to minor provocations. On Saturday afternoon, Anthony Benedetto engaged in a heated argument with an elderly customer who complained about his aggressive sales tactics, leading to a confrontation that required intervention by other customers to prevent escalation. On Sunday morning, Michael was observed by several witnesses engaging in behavior that suggested a complete break from normal business operations. Instead of opening his serving window and preparing to sell ice cream, Michael spent 3 hours parked outside Tommy's apartment building in Dorchester, apparently conducting surveillance of his rival's personal life. "That was when we knew things had gone too far," recalled Rosa Martinez from the community center. "When someone starts bringing work conflicts into residential areas and personal space, they've crossed into territory that's dangerous for everyone involved." The surveillance of Tommy's apartment building represented a crucial escalation that transformed the conflict from a business dispute into what law enforcement would later classify as stalking behavior. Michael's actions suggested that he had begun to view Tommy not as a commercial competitor, but as a personal enemy whose entire existence in Boston was unacceptable. Tommy's discovery of Michael's surveillance activities occurred when he left his apartment Monday morning to find the white ice cream truck parked across the street with Michael clearly visible in the driver's seat. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Tommy realized that his conflict with Michael had evolved beyond business competition into something that threatened his personal safety and peace of mind. "When I saw him sitting there outside my building, I knew we had a real problem," Tommy later told investigators. "That's not business competition. That's harassment. That's someone who's lost touch with reality and decided you're the cause of all their problems." Tommy's response was to confront Michael directly, but the conversation that followed revealed how completely both men's perspectives had been distorted by weeks of escalating conflict. Neither man was capable of hearing the other's concerns or recognizing the legitimacy of opposing viewpoints. "You're not welcome in this neighborhood," Michael told Tommy during the Monday morning confrontation. "You've proven you can't compete fairly, you can't respect traditions, and you can't behave like a civilized human being. It's time for you to leave Boston and find somewhere else to destroy." Tommy's reply revealed his own psychological state. "I'm not going anywhere. This is America, and I have every right to run a business here. If you can't handle competition, that's your problem. But if you keep following me around and harassing me, we're going to have a bigger problem than ice cream sales." The mutual threats marked the point at which both men acknowledged that their conflict could no longer be resolved through business competition or community mediation. Both had reached psychological states where they viewed their rivals' continued presence as intolerable, but neither was prepared to abandon the territory they considered essential to their livelihood and self-respect. Dr. Morrison's later analysis identified this moment as the critical juncture where rational conflict resolution became impossible. Both men had invested so much of their identity and self-worth in the outcome of their rivalry that compromise would have felt like personal annihilation. They had painted themselves into psychological corners where victory was the only acceptable outcome. The final escalation began on Tuesday, July 28th, when Michael decided to implement what he considered the ultimate response to Tommy's refusal to leave Boston voluntarily. Using information he had gathered during his surveillance activities, Michael began systematically contacting Tommy's suppliers, customers, and business contacts with the objective of destroying his rival's ability to continue operating. Michael's campaign included calls to the commissary, where Tommy purchased his ice cream products, the garage where he had his trucks serviced, and the insurance company that provided his commercial coverage. In each case, Michael presented himself as a concerned community member, reporting safety violations, health code issues, or suspicious activities that warranted investigation. "I was trying to use the system against him," Michael later explained to investigators. "He'd shown he wouldn't respect community standards or business ethics, so I decided to let official oversight handle the problem. If he was going to destroy the informal agreements that made our business work, then I'd make sure the formal regulations applied to him." The sabotage campaign revealed how completely Michael's thinking had been warped by the sustained conflict. He had convinced himself that destroying Tommy's business through false reports and malicious interference was a legitimate response to competitive pressure. The rationalization suggested a mental state that could justify increasingly extreme actions as necessary defensive measures. Tommy's discovery of Michael's sabotage efforts occurred when his insurance agent called to report anonymous complaints about his operation that required immediate investigation. The realization that Michael was attacking his business through official channels represented, in Tommy's mind, a declaration of total warfare that demanded an equally aggressive response. "That's when I realized this wasn't going to end with one of us just giving up," Tommy told his brother Anthony that Tuesday evening. "He was trying to destroy my entire operation through lies and sabotage. If that's how he wanted to play it, then we needed to show him that two could play that game." Anthony's response to news of Michael's sabotage campaign was immediate and characteristically aggressive. "If he wants to escalate, we'll escalate. If he wants to play dirty, we can play dirtier than he can imagine." The brothers' decision to retaliate against Michael's sabotage marked the point at which their conflict transcended business competition and entered the realm of personal vendetta. Both sides now viewed their rivalry as an existential struggle, where defeat would mean not just economic loss, but personal humiliation and community exile. Wednesday, July 29th, brought the first direct retaliation when Michael discovered that someone had reported his truck to the health department for alleged violations of food safety regulations. The anonymous complaint triggered an unscheduled inspection that forced Michael to shut down his operation for 6 hours while officials verified compliance with sanitation standards. Michael immediately suspected the Benedetto brothers, and this time his suspicions were correct. Anthony had used the same tactics Michael had employed against them, filing false reports designed to disrupt operations and impose financial costs through regulatory harassment. The tit-for-tat sabotage campaign that followed over the next 3 days created a destructive spiral that consumed both sides' time, energy, and financial resources while generating no revenue for anyone. Michael and the Benedetto brothers were no longer operating ice cream businesses. They were conducting a psychological warfare campaign that used regulatory agencies as weapons against each other. By Friday, August 1st, all 3 men had reached a state of mental and physical exhaustion that made rational decision-making nearly impossible. They had been working 18-hour days for more than a week, dealing with constant stress from regulatory investigations and maintaining psychological vigilance against an enemy they viewed as capable of any destructive action. The final confrontation began on Saturday morning, August 2nd, when Michael arrived at Riverside Park to find both Benedetto trucks already positioned in what he had always considered his primary territory. The sight triggered what psychologists would later describe as an acute stress reaction characterized by tunnel vision, elevated heart rate, and decision-making processes dominated by fight-or-flight responses. I looked at those 2 blue trucks, and I knew that everything I'd tried to do through official channels had failed, Michael later told investigators. They were still there, still stealing my customers, still destroying everything I'd worked for. And I realized that if the system wouldn't protect me, I had to protect myself. Michael's decision to retrieve the .38 caliber revolver he had purchased 3 days earlier marked the point at which a business dispute became a criminal case. The weapon, which Michael had acquired legally through a licensed dealer in response to what he described as threats against his personal safety, transformed his conflict with the Benedetto brothers from harassment into potential violence. The psychological state that led Michael to bring a firearm to a business dispute represented the culmination of 6 weeks of escalating pressure that had systematically eroded his judgment, self-control, and connection to reality. The man who had once prided himself on professional behavior and community relationships had been reduced to someone who viewed armed confrontation as a reasonable response to commercial competition. Tommy and Anthony Benedetto's awareness of Michael's deteriorating mental state should have prompted them to exercise caution or seek official protection. Instead, their own psychological investment in the conflict prevented them from recognizing the danger they faced or taking appropriate steps to de-escalate the situation. The tragedy that unfolded on that Saturday afternoon at Riverside Park occurred not because of a single decision or moment of madness, but because of a systematic breakdown in communication, community mediation, and conflict resolution that had allowed a simple business dispute to evolve into something that none of the participants could control or escape. The events that followed would devastate 3 families, traumatize an entire community, and serve as a permanent reminder of how quickly civility can collapse when pride, desperation, and poor judgment converge in circumstances that offer no easy solutions or graceful exits. When investigators later attempted to understand how a rivalry between ice cream vendors had escalated into such devastating consequences, they found no single moment of decision that could have prevented the tragedy. Instead, they discovered a series of small choices, missed opportunities for intervention, and gradual erosions of judgment that had created an inevitable progression toward violence that surprised everyone who witnessed it, including the men who ultimately became responsible for its consequences. The Boston ice cream murders of 1992 would be remembered not as a story of sudden violence, but as a cautionary tale about the hidden dangers of unresolved conflict and the importance of community systems that can intervene before competition becomes obsession and obsession becomes tragedy.